going to be Stefania, and the title of her speech is New Year's Resolution for Your Company. So please welcome Stefania.
The beginning of the year is a time that an awful lot of people decide they ought to create a New Year's resolution. What do you think are the best criteria or the best characteristics of a New Year's resolution? What do you think?
Realistic.
Realistic,
Measurable.
measurable,
Achievable.
achievable,
Specific.
specific. Another one, Jason?
Timely.
Timely. Well, these are all definitely components. I think what we're hearing is certainly it has to be something that is impactful. Sort of like when you hear people talking about, I want to lose weight or I want to get into shape. It has to be something that perhaps requires very specific actions because it hasn't been getting done before. And then it's something that's got to have a really big benefit. Did you ever think about declaring a New Year's resolution for your company? Let me tell you about a client of mine, Richard. Richard founded his company based on his own experience as a high school student. He had been lucky enough to have been invited for a week by his governor, actually his U.S. senator, to come to D.C. to experience firsthand the business of how we are governed. Richard took advantage of a one-week civics class on leadership. It was a totally real-world experience. It was so impactful that Richard went on to become a Senate staffer, and that allowed him to pay for his own way through a very prestigious university in D.C., getting a degree in government. Richard was on his way to change the world. Midstream in his career, Richard decided it was entrepreneurship that was going to help him change the world. He decided to form a company, which he co-founded, to help other high school students have the experience of a real-world leadership. The way he did it was to be able to set up events with today's current political officials for tomorrow's potential leaders. This experiential learning was so powerful that the students really got a lot out of it. Most importantly, their parents were very impressed. They felt their kids were really getting a one-of-a-kind opportunity, something that positioned them really well for their future committed career, something that allowed them to have a lifetime competitive advantage. With customer satisfaction like that, Richard's revenue was driving, growing. Unfortunately, his profit margins were dropping, actually plummeting. At $100 million in revenue, Richard's profitability had dropped all the way down to 5%, which was a far cry from where he was as a $5 million company at 20%. Richard clearly had plenty of client satisfaction. But what about the shareholder satisfaction? Richard decided to declare a bold New Year's resolution for his company. Great shareholder satisfaction for he and his co-partner. Now, this particular declaration was very important because it actually revealed a very critical issue. Clearly, Richard's company right now was pursuing a business model which was teetering, potentially unable to sustain itself for the future. Richard decided it was high time that he addressed these issues. But you know, like an awful lot of business owners, it's hard when you take a look at your current business model, the one that helped you get where you are, and try to figure out what else it could be. After all, it was initially successful. Now this happens to an awful lot of business owners. It's really sort of hard to imagine what else it could be. Richard needed to get out of the box he was in to find a new solution. After 2 decades of growing his business, he decided to confront himself, challenge his own ideas. And he did it by asking himself 3 questions. Question number 1. What do satisfied customers expect? Question number 2. What is the bottleneck that's holding your growth hostage? Question number 3. What is the most negative impact on your profitability? Richard pondered these questions really deeply. For question number 1, what do satisfied customers expect? He decided it was actually fun. That's what the kids would say. But from his parents' perspective, it was the transformational experience, the one-time life opportunity for a competitive advantage that would put them on a good stead for a career. Then Richard thought about the second question. What is holding hostage your growth? What is that bottleneck to growth? Richard determined that that was scheduling. You see, early on when he was developing these events with leaders, there was always some political officials that were available. But as the number of children that he was providing guidance to increased, there weren't always that many more politicians. And worse, a lot of these politicians were actually on other schedules. A new legislative item would come up and they had to be elsewhere. The third element was the question 3. What was the biggest negative impact on profitability? Richard figured this out quickly. It was the logistics. You see, again, when he started out early on, the whole business was based on Richard organizing events for students. Now, these events were around the country, and he could manage them all for a couple hundred kids. Clearly, as the number of children increased and the event locations went around the world, Richard had a much more logistical problem. It took over 1,000 staffers to deal with the buses, the hotels, the management and safety of all these children, all around the different locations that they had to go. And this was all one-off events. The answers to these 3 questions gave Richard a lot of ideas. Clearly, this New Year's resolution was focusing attention on changes that would be impactful to his company. This business model needed to be modified. In order to be able to execute this New Year's resolution of great shareholder value, Richard realized he needed some committed actions. So to reinforce this resolution, he decided to identify 3 different activities that he could use. Again, they were based on the 3 questions. So addressing the question number 1, which is, what do satisfied clients expect? He determined that his action needed to be to protect and preserve the gold standard. Kids had to be having fun, and parents had to be sure that this was forwarding their careers. Addressing the question number 2, what is holding hostage the company's growth? Richard determined that that was the issue that required scheduling to be predictable. Instead of relying on just politicians, because they were clearly unavailable all the time, Richard decided he could be more broad with his solutions. He could reach out to dignitaries in lots of different disciplines. Maybe they were Nobel laureates. Maybe they were humanitarians. Maybe they were scientists or business executives. 3 was the question related to what's the biggest impact negatively on profit margins. Richard decided that the action had to be to address that logistics juggernaut. Here's where he had an epiphany. He realized in today's environment, today's generation, kids go to rock star concerts. Why not just have the kids show up directly at an extravaganza where he could provide experiential training with these leaders in a large format? Instead of just dealing with a couple of 100 kids, now we could deal with 1,000 kids, tens of thousands of kids. All it took was a resolution for his company, great shareholder satisfaction, to drive a whole new business model that could put his company on a sustainable path. As a result of doing these things, the business model that he revised after 2 decades positioned his company in a way that allowed him to capitalize on the economy of scale he really had available to him. And that's pretty critical because with a projection of 200 million, Richard is now looking at a financial model which generates 20% profitability. A reversal of that decline process that he'd been experiencing. At $200 million, that's a lot of customer satisfaction. And it's also a lot of shareholder satisfaction. Best of all, as part of this New Year's resolution, Richard now has a business model that keeps shareholder value and customer value in lockstep, so he can't be out of sync. So the question I would pose to you is simple. What is your New Year's resolution for your company? What is it worth to you? Let's take a look at those 3 questions and apply them to your company.